All right, this is the beginning of Unit 6. This is our first section. In this unit, we're going to be hitting different things by categories. Like this one is the Cowboys and Indians, has miners too in it. Another section is going to be farmers. Another section will be with the industrial changes, inventions, immigration, and then urbanization. So it's different things. They are actually interconnected together, even though they are selected, and we'll see that even with the Cowboys, that yeah, it's something different, but why things happen, and the steel industry is intertwined with it there. Bracketing dates for this one, the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction begins 1865, and then the 1877, the end of Reconstruction. There are some things that will continue on through the end of the 1800s in this category here. Specifically, the 2.7 review, the Native American experience, will be on the standards, but a lot of these are in parts of this. This is one, though, the key events of Florida is important because there are several things that tie in with this one in here. All right, start with look at things, and I want you to close your eyes for a second and see what your image of the cowboy is. All right, look at the cowboy up and down. What do you see? Now, open your eyes, and this is where in class I had people raise their hand, and how many people that was their cowboy white on there. And that is where the majority of the people, that's what they end up talking about. But the real cowboy was not what we normally think of. More than likely, they were Hispanic or Mexican American. Probably as likely, or maybe even more likely, to be African American than Caucasian there. The image that we have of the cowboy comes about, though, because of several different things. The Wild West show by Buffalo Bill will be one of the first things that will spur that idea there. He will go like a three-ring circus, but he'll have this show going from town to town or city to city in the East there. Later on, we're going to have movies that will make this image, and we'll have our main characters being white. We had dime novels after the Civil War. Those were basically books that today would be like $10 books there, but cheap paperback books. Since their main audience was middle and upper class whites, they made the heroes, these cowboys, white. And again, that's what happened in movies. That will happen with TV shows later on that we'll have. Also, a lot of things for the cowboy. Our cowboys were, for the most part, very poor. Many of them did not even own their own horse. They only owned their saddle and whatever's in their saddlebags. Most cowboys did not walk around with the six-shooters. Yes, in the towns they would have those, but not on the horse. If they had a gun, their gun of choice would have been like a Winchester lever action gun that they would have. All right, the cow towns and the cow trails. This is something, if you were in class, we'd spend a while on the cows are dumb. I would be telling different cow stories along the way, where cows running into trees when they're in a stampede. But that is where, to summarize this very shortly, is the most dangerous things for a cowboy on the trails were stampedes there. So they would be taking the cattle from Texas up to Kansas. Now they're going to Kansas because that's where the rail lines were ending at that time, and they needed to get them to the rail lines. At the end of these trails would be these boom towns, Abilene and other towns in Kansas there. And this is where a lot of your Wild West image comes from, these towns, although more of it would be in the mining towns than what you would have there. Now, along the trail, the cowboys, which are pretty much, again, I said very poor, they do not get paid until they reach their designation at the end. And then they get paid, and that's where these boom towns, you can imagine what would be like a lot of poor workers today suddenly getting a huge amount of money for the last 3 or 4 months of work. So you think about if you had someone that hasn't got paid and now gets paid $5,000 there in this town. So where are they going to go? What are they going to do? Many of them are going to blow their money in the first couple of days, whether it be by drinking or gambling there. And again, that wasn't everyone. There were some, like in the movie of Old Yeller, where the dad comes back, but that's not what most of our cowboys were. They were usually single men that were going. In these boom towns, which we'll come back to that in the miners' towns, because that's where a lot of these boom towns were for mining, you'll have different vigilantes that come, and they'll emerge. Probably the most famous of them was the sheriff of Abilene, Wild Bill Hickok. there. And it, basically making some sort of law and order until a government could be established in those there. And this is where a lot of the governments that were established were once more women came. And we'll watch in class a little excerpt from the show Adam Ruins Everything there, which kind of tells about the role of women and where to win, and where women were the first to be able to vote in the western states. Now, why did it start? Why did it end? This is where you kind of look, and like I say to my students in class, you're never going to have an EOC question about the cattle trails themselves, or I don't think you'd ever have it. But here's where it interacts. Still is going to be really important. This same time period is when Andrew Carnegie will develop a better method for making steel. It's a lot cheaper, it's stronger, it can be made thinner, more pliable than the old iron. So cans, you may not think of beef in can, but you would have the canning like you have for canned tuna and turkey there. The cattle, when they were driven to Kansas, where they were put on railroad lines, those railroad lines would take them to Chicago, and Chicago became one of the top places for slaughterhouses. That's why the Chicago NBA team is the Chicago Bulls. From there, after they were butchered and in bigger pieces, we had refrigerated rail cars that would then take them to the cities in the north, like New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Now, why did those cities want more beef? A lot of people got rich in the Civil War in these cities there. In the Civil War said it was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Well, again, there were people that got extremely wealthy and they wanted beef in their diet. So they were able to pay for it. So that's why those cows that were so cheap in Texas were worth a lot of money in Philadelphia, Boston, New York. Now what ends it? Once again, it'll be still. Joseph Glidden will invent barbed wire. And so that is where some of the areas, those trails were being fenced off. Once Andrew Carnegie makes the steel that can be made into barbed wire. But probably a bigger thing that ended it was you didn't need them, because you would have the rail lines that were no longer ending in Kansas. They get down to Texas and other areas. So there would be some shorter parts, but as we go along, the rails go closer and closer to where the ranches are. And so those cattle trails got shorter and shorter in the decade or two after the Civil War. And Glidden was the one with barbed wire. Chicago was a place for meat packing plants. This is where, again, Adam Ruins Everything. If you were to look it up on YouTube, there's two different parts of the episode talking about for the Cowboys. All right, do not do a big section about the mining here, but we'll have boomtowns that arrive when different gold and silver is discovered out west. Earlier we had about the California gold rush and the 49ers that went there, but we're going to happen in the Comstock Lode in Nevada and other areas here. Part for Adam Ruins Everything talks about how women were helped develop some of these towns in the West, and this is where I give examples of entrepreneurs, not just women, but you have these entrepreneurs that find a way. Most of the people that got rich with the gold rush were not the people finding the gold or the silver. They were the people that found a way to make money selling products. Best example will be Levi Strauss, who starts with the Levi's and the jeans when he originally went to California planning to make tents with his canvas that he had. But here's where, for another connection we have, what's the effect on the Indians? And this is where time and time again, where we had promised the Native Americans land there. Once gold was discovered, we will kick them off the land. Didn't matter what the treaty was that it was signed last there. Great example of this will be later on in this section. We will have about the biggest battle in the Indian War history for the United States, the Battle of Little Bighorn, which occurred when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was the religious land, the sacred land for the Sioux, that we had promised that they'd have it forever and ever, but once gold was discovered, we will then go to those areas. Some other side effects, the vigilantes that I mentioned before, like Wild Bill Hickok and the Cowtown, but we're going to have this take place, and the boomtowns were actually not just the cowtowns, the western towns were usually in places out west. Our immigration part, we're going to see that we will have discrimination against especially Asian miners there. We're going to have a tax on foreign miners in California. This will also be some of the stimulus for the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is in 1882. We say that no more Chinese are allowed to immigrate to the United States. In your notes, this might be shuffled a little bit for the slides, but the overall, most of these things are in one little section. We did not in Florida have gold and silver, but we did have boomtowns in here, and actually right close to here. Inverness itself had some phosphate was discovered, but it never became a huge boomtown there. But Dunnellon, where John Dunn had one of his workers discover some phosphate, tried to buy up land, and over the next 2 decades, we will have thousands of people move to Dunnellon. Same thing happened in Floral City. If we were to go to 1900, where Inverness only had several hundred people living in it, Floral City had over 10,000 people at times, Dunnellon over 10,000 people. In this area where you would think that probably Ocala was the first for everything, but a lot of things, Dunnellon was the first with a lot of the electricity and ice houses and things like that. But this boomtown will die out once the First World War starts, because phosphate, which is used for fertilizer mainly, but also for weapons, the biggest customers were in Germany. So once the war starts, they no longer have those customers. After the war, the shift of the phosphate will shift from our area then down to the Lakeland area, where they have huge pits. But some of the area that we have in Citrus County and the nearby outside of Dunnellon, we still have those pits. Again, our most famous golf course and one of the top golf courses in Florida with Black Diamond is built on the old phosphate pits. That's why there's huge areas. Some of you that live near Holder, there's areas. A lot of people like to go off-roading in there. Even in like Whispering Pines Park, there's some areas. It wasn't intensive mining that was done there, but we did have some. All right, for Florida, we didn't have cowboys. We have men in Florida. They're not boys. And for Florida, we have the cow hunters. In there. Now they're sometimes called the Cracker Cowboys, and the name Cracker comes from where moving the cattle, you would move them using a whip. I was in class, I told stories about how do you stop a stampede, and a lot of times what you do is your horse does the work in there, but you are riding alongside, and you basically crack the whip to make them turn to the other way. So you would crack a whip over their ear. You don't actually hit the cow, it's the crack and the snap of the whip, the sound that will scare them and make them turn. And if you have cows that are stampeding, you try to get them where they're starting basically running in large circles, and eventually they retire out and go down. In Florida, we will have cattle, and we were actually more of the Wild West than a lot of areas that are in the West, and that had more the farming side of it. We had wild cattle going back from the Spanish days. You would have people that they brand them, and then you would have various roundups. They were not long drives like what you had from Texas to Kansas, but you would be driving them to Fort Pierce or Tampa or Punta Rosa, which is part of Fort Myers today. There. And there were a few of these Florida cattle barons that were just extremely rich. Now, I know this guy doesn't look very rich here. This is Jacob Summerlin. And Jacob Summerlin, in today's terms, would probably be a billionaire. He owned thousands of head of cattle. He will be the one that will start the wharves at Punta Rosa, or he would buy them and take over them. He will, for the town of Jernigan, which later on became this place called Orlando, he will, for his wife, go and build 2 really nice hotels there, even though he didn't spend time. He spent probably half the year in little places like this. It looked like the Seminole Cheeky huts, but all throughout the areas in Florida, you would have these where the cattlemen, when they're driving cattle, and at night they would stay in these places there. Now, our cows in Florida, they're smaller, but that's because of the heat. Just like our deer are smaller, but you can have a lot more of them than what you would have up north there. But because they did not get as big and as fat, they were not bought by the same markets that they were buying the Texas cows. Most of our cows were bought in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Spanish possessions like that, which then they got paid in gold bullion and gold coins there. So when they got that, this is where they became very rich. During Reconstruction, though, that made them a target. And this is where we have this feud that I'll talk about in a second, where a lot of those scallywags that were established in the Republican government will go after these cattle barons there. For Jacob Summerlin, besides talking about it, he established a lot of stuff for Orlando long before Mickey Mouse came. Florida Southern College was started by him. What today would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions of dollars, that he gave to start that. A guy that could barely read and write, but he actually did a lot in a lot of those communities. And again, Florida was like the Wild West. Even Thomas Edison, when he would build a winter home, they stayed in Fort Myers. They were scared about the electric lights, and it would scare the cattle because they would be still herding cows right down the middle of Fort Myers there. Florida would be an open range state till 1950, which meant if you were driving down Pleasant Grove Road and you hit a cow, it was your responsibility to pay the farmer for the cow you hit there, not the farmer's responsibility to keep them out. Again, this is where you look at, I had this on another PowerPoint, but in 1880 you see the population of Florida, especially the peninsula of Florida, was very sparsely. Our area was 1 person per square mile there, and this is where there were a lot more cows than there were people, and this is 1880. Again, we were a lot more of the Wild West than a lot of places you think of, and that we had. And then we had the boomtowns with it. All right, the biggest feud in Florida occurred because of this with those cattlemen, and then also Reconstruction. The man in the picture up there, that is David Mizell. He was the sheriff of Orange County, where Orlando is. He had some warrants to go arrest some of these cattlemen for various crimes. Most of them were actually just trumped up or made up crimes, but what they were doing is trying to arrest them. They would take over their cattle, sell their cattle, and then use the money for things that they were using for Reconstruction. A lot of it was for good, like the schools for the Freedmen Bureaus, but some of it wasn't there. But David Mizell was killed at an area, Bull Creek. He was accused of the Yates family and the Barber family, that some of them were the ones that set up an ambush and killed him as the sheriff. They then go and try to find various people. If you go to Orlando, David Mizell's house is now part of Lou Gardens in Winter Park. But for the next decade, there will be this feud between these different groups. I actually know a lot about this personally in there where I researched it, but I had family where I'm a Bass. The Basses were actually on both sides of this feud in there, but I'm also related to the Barbers. In fact, one of the Barbers that I had, which would be my 6th generation grandfather, was a preacher. They were trying to get, because his brother had killed someone else, they actually killed him during this. Again, 41 people were killed. It's kind of like the Hatfields and McCoys that you have up in the Appalachian Mountains, but right here in Central Florida where this took place. All right, our next section on this is where we had the Cowboys. We had a little section with the miners. Now we get with the Native Americans. For the Great Plains, we don't have much for the Native Americans for the history, because the state of Florida, the way that standards is you should have been taught a lot more in both 5th and 8th grade. We're kind of covering up in the chronological, the last part. So we'll be saying more for the Great Plains Indians. Now, where you studied more about the Oregon Trail and going to California and that in middle school, that area in between was skipped, the Great Plains, but they thought it was unfarmable. And so a lot of times it was called the Great American Desert in there. But say, what changed to make it alone? This is where all of these things come together again. First of all, once trains were expanding out west, then for things that you needed in those areas of the Great Plains that you didn't have, the trains could bring those supplies. Something as simple as lumber that you would need. We're going to have the steel plow that will once we make a better steel and John Deere improves the plow, we will have a plow that then can cut through that prairie grass that couldn't be done very well before. The cattle boom will bring more people to areas like Kansas and Nebraska. Some of the areas where gold and silver was found that are on the edges of this area. So all these things will bring people to where, after Civil War, the last area that was left wild that Native Americans had there. Now, traditionally, the Great Plains Indians, and this is ones that most people know about the most there, were the ones that had followed around the buffalo, been the basis for their life. After the Spanish came and some of the horses got loose, the Native Americans learned how to use the horse and became some of the greatest horsemen in the world with that. But what ends up happening in the 1860s and the 1870s is the population of the buffalo will be decimated. We're going to have white men that are going and hunting them. Some of them are killing them just for fun. I know I have a picture showing where there's a train, they stop to shoot them. And building the railroad tracks, this is where William Cody got his nickname of Buffalo Bill, because we'll have hunters that go and feed the workers while going and kill the buffalo. Most of the buffalo that were killed by the white hunters, usually they only took two things off them. They took their hide and then their tongue. The rest of the meat was left to rot. Meanwhile, Native Americans, which that was part of their life of following these around, that's why they are the Indians that usually lived in teepees as they followed these sorts around. Their way of life was pretty much destroyed in a 2-decade period there. There are a lot of different tribes, and we're not going to go deeply into any of them in here. The most powerful tribe is the Sioux. There are going to be other tribes, some that got along, some that did not. There like the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Pawnee, the Cheyenne. And some of them were more in the Great Plains, some were in the mountains, some of them went in and out of the areas that you have. I usually show in Dances with Wolves this one scene where they come across where the white hunters came, and you see the image of all these buffalo that are there that are just rotting, and they're the only thing taken off is their hide and their tongue with it. All right, for the longest time, our policy in the United States was the concentration policy or reservation policy. The U.S. made reservations there, and we forced the Native Americans to live in these concentrated areas. In many ways, they are concentrated camps. We don't call them that for history reasons in there. But Adolf Hitler actually used the United States as an example of how to get rid of unwanted people, saying that what you can't kill off, put them on areas that you don't desire. Most of the land that we left for them was usually not something that they can live on. We would promise the Native Americans that we'd provide them with what they need, but that promise was not usually fulfilled. Plus, many of them, they didn't understand where they were locked into a small area. Plus, we might have an area like in the Black Hills where if something desirable was found, like gold, we would then suddenly change the rules and kick them off of this. We have many different battles, and I put that in quotation marks because some of these battles were not much massacres. We have the Sand Creek Massacre while the Civil War is going on. For this, the tribe of Indians that were on this reservation, they did have a hunting party that was out there, but they were flying two flags over their camp, an American flag and a white flag. And the U.S. Army was coming because some horses had been stolen. They come and shoot mainly women and children. Finding out afterwards that it wasn't that tribe, which was Cheyenne, it was actually some, I believe, Pawnee Indians that had stolen the horses there. The Washita River Massacre, a lot of times will show sometime in this section an excerpt from the movie Little Big Man there, which is, they take some idea, but this is where it's some pretty vivid scenes that you have. But so these battles were not really a lot of times battles, but they were massacres there. The one battle you definitely need to know for this part, though, is the Battle of Little Bighorn. Notice the date, 1876. This is near the end of President Grant's term in office. And what had happened here is where the treaty had been broken with the Sioux for the Black Hills once gold was discovered. The United States sends in the 7th Cavalry led by George Custer. Custer believes that there's a small group. He's actually lured into a trap, and then the 7th Cavalry is completely surrounded by thousands of Indians, and all of the soldiers are killed. Now, this was what all the Indian wars for U.S. history. This is the greatest Indian victory, if not one of them. Dade City nearby for the Seminole Indians is arguably one that's similar to this, but the 7th Cavalry is wiped out. Now, the problem that you have is that the Native Americans, yes, they wiped out that detachment of the Army. They went and separated, went their own way. The U.S. sent more armies and then went after these smaller groups in there. And eventually then pushing more of them onto different reservations and killing their way of life. The two Native American leaders you need to know is Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They're both kind of like generals. Sitting Bull was more of the the person doing the strategy and the general and the planner, and the crazy horse was more of the on-field general there. And this is where in South Dakota where you have the crazy horse monument that's being continued to be built there, but you can visit it in South Dakota today there. The leader was crazy, or George Custer for the 7th Cavalry. All right, I summed up a lot of things in here. The first thing is where I say the sad ending for Plains Indians, and this is some of the Western Indians there. We will even have in some places where peaceful Indians were, and where I have it in quotation marks for Indian hunting, it was just that. Now, it was illegal, but there would be people that will go in California from the time of the gold rush and afterwards, would go into these reservations and just shoot Indians there. And sometimes even when a judge they would get caught and they would be tried for it, pretty much it would be a slap on their wrist there, not even as if they were people. Probably one of the saddest stories that we have is of Chief Joseph, Chief Joseph and the Nez Pierce Indians were on a reservation. They were starving to death, so they were trying to escape. They were not trying to fight the U.S. Army. They were trying to escape up into Canada. And we will send the U.S. Army basically to chase after them, track them down, and put them back on the reservation. This is in 1887, and by this time, some of the ideas and the feelings against Native Americans had really changed. And this is where the newspapers following this, and the idea that we have in there. But most of these changes would not be made for a long time there. A lot of this will start in the New Deal, and then in the decades following that. Our last battle that you need to know here, and once again this battle is in quotation marks, is Wounded Knee. It's in 1890. Sitting Bull, who in between the time of the Battle of Little Bighorn and this, he had actually gone and been in part of Buffalo Bill's show. But a lot of the Indians were doing a ghost dance, and what this was, the idea that there was like a religious ceremony, and with this dance, if they were to dance, the buffalo would come back, the army would leave here. Well, as hundreds of these Native Americans gathered together, the army is watching them. They are supposed to be unarmed. They come in, they do a search of Sitting Bull's tent. They do find a pistol. Somewhere someone fired something. It was largely believed that it was a soldier that accidentally fired a gun, but once the gun fired, we will then have the army shooting this unarmed Indians in there. And you see the picture to the right where it is a massacre. It's not a real battle in that case, but this is our last battle of it. And a lot of people say it's kind of significant, or like a lot of things with the Indians, because a lot of that was not a true battle there, but it was a massacre. All right, a couple of things that you need to know for Native Americans here is we will have a book. Not everybody felt the same way, but in 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson will write a book called The Century of Dishonor. And she will tell of a lot of the things that had happened to the Native Americans there. Things that you learn about, the Trail of Tears, and all of these different contracts and treaties that have been broken by the U.S. government towards the Native Americans. So a lot of people were wanting to help and try to reform this. And so Congress will pass in 1887 the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act was meant to help the Native Americans. And here's where sometimes you will see in Washington, the purpose is to help out Native Americans, but there are other people that know better and are in many ways tricking them. And what ended up happening is it was meant to help, but it actually ended up hurting a lot of the Native American tribes. Now, one thing that you have, and you see this word assimilation, the idea was to assimilate or Americanize the Indians. And this is where there were certain things, and you see this picture of, we have Indian schools that were established. And when they went to these Indian schools, they were not supposed to speak their native tongue. Luckily for us, some of these, their language was passed down from generation to generation, as we will see in World War II with the Navajo Indians. But the idea was that they were going to, again, Americanize them. Well, they should be farmers. And what they did is they looked at things, and, well, we have the Homestead Act that gives each family 160 acres. So for the Native Americans, they would give them 160 acres. The problem is a lot of the land they have, 160 acres in Arizona, is definitely not the same as 160 acres in Alabama, where the way the soil was. So a lot of that area needed a lot more soil, and in many places it actually took away more land from the Native Americans in it. And again, the purpose was to help them in there. Now, the other side was the land, it was going to try to make it more individual, not to the tribes there. And that's why it took the land away there. And we'll come to the Homestead Act, which again is for the farmers. The Dawes Act will be the official policy until we get to the 1930s. Then in the Indian New Deal, there will be some changes, and then more changes in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s for Native Americans. When I say, what do you see? You see on that map the areas that are in red. There are not much land that is left for the Native Americans, for some that had owned everything from sea to shining sea at one time. And even large areas, like you see the biggest areas around the Four Corners area, a lot of that is land that is not very arable. Assimilation is a word you're going to see again when we also have for our immigrants, where we want to Americanize the immigrants, we want to Americanize the Native Americans. I throw this in here, we'll have it again in the Spanish-American War, but this is where for Buffalo soldiers, our U.S. Army was segregated after the Civil War, and there were some units that were African-American units in the segregated army, and some of them were used in the Indian Wars at that time. So this is where for Buffalo soldiers, and that's where the nickname came from. Bob Marley later on will have a song. There will be groups that will fight in the Spanish-American War, and they will actually be here in Florida during that time. And this is a picture of the Buffalo soldiers when they were in Florida before they left for the Spanish-American War there. But that was after they were with the Indian Wars. Again, to the two battles you need to know off the top of your head are Wounded Knee and Little Bighorn there, and know the difference between the two of them. All right, the Oklahoma Land Rush. This kind of puts a couple things together that we have. Now, the Dawes Act, again, it was meant to help the Native Americans, but it actually took land away. So earlier in history, in the 1820s and 30s, we had the Indian Removal Acts that sent the Indians to Oklahoma, or that they called Indian Territory at that time. So all the area of Oklahoma was supposed to be for those eastern tribes there, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Chickamauga, Choctaw, Seminole Indians, as well as some of the tribes from the Midwest that were given land in it. So all of Oklahoma was for the Native Americans. But where the Dawes Act was supposed to help them, when we individualized it and give each family 160 acres, it actually took away a big portion of Oklahoma there. And what will happen is they will then take that land that the Indians lost, and they will open it up for whites and blacks that will use the Homestead Act. And what they'll do is they will come out and they'll survey lands, and then they will have a literal race that you go and claim. I'll show a clip from the movie Far and Away in here where what they have to do. But we have, like you see this picture and there that we have of these people that are going. Now, the name Sooners. The Sooners is the nickname for the University of Oklahoma. That comes from this historical event, because some of the people cheated. They would go into the areas, hide out, and claim the very best land there. Now, if you were caught, you would be shot there, but they weren't caught, and so that's where they ended up getting the very best pieces of land, something along rivers and areas like that. Another term you need to know that fits in this time period were the Exodusters. Now, those of you who know the Bible will know the term Exodus, the second book of the Bible there for the Jewish people as they are escaping from Egypt with Moses there. But this is where, for the Exodusters, this is where a lot of African Americans, they realized after Reconstruction that the South was not going to give them an opportunity. And with the Homestead Act that we'll learn later on, many of them will move to Kansas and Oklahoma and get a chance to get 160 acres here. And this is why many of them will go with because of the Dawes Act. So where one of your reflection questions, this is something that the Dawes Act actually hurt the Native Americans, but it actually will help out some groups And like some of the African Americans, it will open up some areas of land for them that they may not have had. I had this in another section, but it'll pop up a couple different times. And this is where the closing of the West, that's a lot of times seen in there, that as we are expanding and we're going into that middle area of the Great Plains. Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian, and he wrote that America was great because we always had land, and basically how we were pioneers and our rugged individualism, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps ideas there. And notice he wrote in 1893, which is around the time that we call the closing of the frontier. So where are we going to go from there once the frontier is closed? There. 1890 census basically said it was settled in there. So where are we going to go? Which in our next unit we will have the section on imperialism and come here. A couple other things there. For art, there is the Rocky Mountain School. It's not an actual school, although like there is a Rocky Mountain College there, but it's a style of painting. The most famous of these painters is Friedrich Remington there, and he would write about this Western. And here's something that cowboy image that we have. Some of it comes from his paintings, even though he was a Native American, and he's famous for his statues that he would have. And one thing for Americans, we usually weren't real good in art, except for like earlier the Hudson River School was more landscapes. Here we have for a lot of things that are natural side in there. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, that part from Adams Ruined Everything, had mentioned with that, and that's part of the image that we will have of the West. Again, it'll be like a three-ring circus, except for he will have acts where they have buffalo come in. They have trained cowboys that are doing the horse tricks in there. Sitting Bull was a part of this show after Little Bighorn. There, Sitting Bull, who hated white man, but he loved shaking hands. So as people would go in, he would just sit there shaking hands with this big grin on his face in there. Annie Oakley, one of the most famous shooters of all time that we have. But this is where I kind of see the idea of the American spirit, not just the image of the cowboy, but this is where for a lot of Americans that we have this idea of our pioneer spirit, our rough and toughness that we have in there. So, and that's where for our cowboy. If you go to It's a Small World at Disney World, the image of the Americans at the end, the two American children, as a cowboy and a cowgirl, which I know all of you are wearing your cowboy hat and your boots there. But that's where the image of this. The Wild West show, when it went for the East, those cities, and then went to Europe. And then we will have those dime novels. We will have the American movies. The very first movie ever like big time movie was a Western about the Great Train Robbery there. We'll later on have our TV shows. Again, this is where probably for a lot of Europeans, they're thinking of an American is the idea of like John Wayne that we have in here. What artists encountered and drew the Florida Cracker Cowboys for Harper's Magazine in 1895? It's Friedrich Remington. And this is where for the cow hunter, that was actually Bones Mizell. That was a storyteller more than anything else. But he was here in Florida and was drawing pictures for the magazine. So not only a Western, but he was making for the Western pictures here. One famous Indian leader was imprisoned at Fort Pickens, Santa Rosa Island. It was Geronimo. This is where when they were captured, they wanted to get them out of the West and out of the Texas area. So he was imprisoned for 2 years outside of Pensacola